Imagine, just for a second, that you are stripped of absolutely everything. I mean, you're pulled from your home, your family is gone, your clothes are taken.
Yeah. And even your life's work is confiscated.
Right. Even your own name is just, erased, replaced by
It's
another.
completely erased.
You are essentially dropped into the middle of a raging pitch black ocean with no boat. And I think most of us assume that in a situation with zero external control, where your autonomy is just totally annihilated, you would just drown.
Well, yeah, it's the logical assumption, right? When every single physical and social structure you rely on just vanishes overnight, the standard expectation is that the human psyche would simply collapse.
But what if, right in that exact moment, you discover you still have an anchor, like a psychological anchor that no force on earth can actually take from you?
And that anchor is your freedom to choose how you respond.
Exactly. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We're taking a journey through one of the most profoundly influential books of the 20th century, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
And for this analysis, we're drawing directly from Frankl's original 1946 account of his time in the Nazi concentration camps, plus his later 1984 postscript on tragic optimism.
We've also got some academic breakdowns of his therapeutic method, logotherapy, and historical context from the Viktor Frankl Institute.
Right, because our mission today is to completely unpack Frankl's experience and, the psychological theories that came out of it.
Yeah, we want to distill these massive, really intense concepts into simple language that makes sense for everyday life.
Right.
Because, well, while this text starts in the darkest place imaginable, the ultimate goal here is to give you practical tools to find purpose in your own modern life.
To really grasp the weight of his theories, we first have to understand the crucible where they were forged. I mean, Frankl was just a successful psychiatrist in Vienna in the 1930s. Totally normal life. Completely ordinary. Right up until the moment he was transported to the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz.
And right upon arrival, the brutality is just instantaneous. There's this terrifying introduction to the camp dynamic that Frankl describes as the finger game.
Oh, the finger game. That initial selection process was just a masterclass in dehumanization.
How did it work? Exactly.
So as the prisoners got off the transport, an SS officer stood before them, simply pointing a finger to the left or to the right.
Just a casual point.
Yeah, exactly. To the left meant immediate death in the gas chambers, which that was the fate for about 90% of the people on Frankl's transport.
Oh, 90%.
Yeah. And to the right meant hard labor. It was this split-second verdict on whether a human being had the right to exist for one more day.
I mean, I can't even fathom the psychological whiplash of that. And even if you were sent to the right, the stripping of your identity began immediately.
Absolutely.
Like, Frankl had this scientific manuscript hidden in the inner pocket of his coat. It was his life's work, his legacy, everything he had built his whole career on.
And he tried to keep it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he tried to confide in an older prisoner, begging to keep it. But the older prisoner just laughed at him. Frankl literally had to throw his coat onto a pile. He wrote that this was the moment he had to strike out his whole former life.
And that stripping away triggers the first major psychological phase Frankl identifies, which is shock.
Right, phase one.
And what's fascinating about this phase is the mechanism the brain uses to cope. It's accompanied by what he calls an illusion of reprieve.
Illusion of reprieve.
Yeah.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, the mind simply cannot process the finality and the scale of the horror, so it creates this false hope that things might not be as bad as they seem.
Like a defense mechanism. But then reality sets in. And Frankl describes this weird state of cold curiosity.
Yeah, it's almost like the brain steps outside of the body to just, I don't know, observe the surreal nature of the environment, totally detached from the danger.
The nervous system basically short circuits.
Exactly. When a threat is too massive to fight or flee, the mind detaches. You become an objective observer of your own suffering.
And through that cold curiosity, Frankl realized that everything he had learned in medical school about human fragility was completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely. The idea that textbooks tell lies.
Okay, let's unpack this. The realization that textbooks tell lies. Because I think about this all the time. If I don't get like 7 hours of sleep in a comfortable bed, I am a total wreck.
Right, and medical textbooks validated that. They stated humans couldn't survive without a certain baseline of sleep or warmth or nutrition.
But then he gets to the camp.
Yeah, and Frankl found himself sleeping on bare boards in a tier with 8 other men. They shared 2 thin blankets in the freezing chill of late autumn.
And their pillows were their own shoes.
Their shoes, caked in frozen mud. And yet the body adapted. It survived.
It's just wild what the body can endure. But that initial shock doesn't last forever. Eventually, that cold curiosity fades into the second phase, which Frankl calls apathy.
Yeah, phase 2.
I tend to think of this as like emotional hibernation.
That's a good way to put it. Emotional death is the clinical term he points toward. The daily, relentless exposure to suffering just blunts the emotions entirely.
Because feeling things takes energy.
Right, exactly. Empathy actually requires a tremendous amount of cognitive and emotional energy. In an environment where you are starving and freezing, the brain literally shuts down its empathy receptors.
Just to consolidate all available energy toward keeping the physical body alive.
Right. It prioritizes pure survival over emotion.
There's a story he tells in the book that is, honestly, incredibly difficult to read, but it perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, the sick bay story.
Yeah. So Frankel was standing at the sick bay. His own feet were swollen with edema, and he was just hoping for a day of lighter work. And while he's waiting, a 12-year-old boy is carried in.
Such a horrifying scene.
It really is. This child had been forced to stand barefoot in the snow. His toes were so severely frostbitten that the camp doctor was picking off the gangrenous black stumps with tweezers.
And Frankel's reaction.
That's the thing. Frankel, a trained physician who took an oath to heal, felt absolutely nothing. He watched, completely unmoved. The disgust, the horror, the pity, it had all vanished.
It had to vanish. If he allowed himself to feel the full weight of that 12-year-old's suffering, his psyche would have just shattered. Apathy was a required defense mechanism.
But here is where I get really stuck.
Okay.
If you are emotionally dead, like if you have completely shut down all feeling just to survive the day, how do you find any reason to keep waking up? Wouldn't apathy just naturally lead to giving up entirely?
That is the pivotal question of his entire experience. And he observed that amidst this enforced physical and mental primitiveness, something deeply counterintuitive happened.
What is that?
He noticed that sensitive people, the ones who were accustomed to a rich intellectual or spiritual life, often survived the brutal camp environment better than those of a more robust, purely physical nature.
Oh, because they had somewhere else to go in their minds.
Yeah. Exactly. They could retreat inward. They had cultivated a life of inner riches that the guards couldn't touch. Frankel gives this incredible example of marching to a work site in the freezing, pitch-dark morning.
Slipping on icy puddles, being beaten by guards.
Right. And to escape the immediate physical agony, he began vividly imagining conversations with his wife, Tilly.
And he didn't even know if she was still alive at that point, did he?
He had absolutely no idea. But the love he felt in his mind was as real and powerful as any physical presence. He also experienced what he called negative happiness.
Negative happiness. I love that concept. Meaning joy drawn from the smallest, most trivial contrast to suffering.
Like the tango story.
Yes, he was awakened one night in the barracks by a violin playing a desperately sad tango in the dark. And he just wept, remembering it was his wife's 24th birthday.
It's a beautiful, heartbreaking moment. In the middle of hell, his humanity is asserting itself.
And that leads to the profound realization that closes out this phase of his experience. Even when humans are subjected to the absolute worst conditions imaginable, stripped of every possession and basic right, they retain one ultimate inner freedom.
The freedom to choose their attitude in any given set of circumstances.
Right. So if you're listening to this right now and you're facing an unavoidable frustration, maybe a toxic work environment, a health scare, or just a deeply difficult relationship.
You might not be able to control the external event.
Exactly. But you have complete jurisdiction over the attitude you adopt while walking through it. That inner fortress is yours alone.
But the psychological journey doesn't end when the external suffering stops. Which brings us to the conclusion of this chapter, the liberation.
Yeah, phase 3. You would expect liberation to be a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Like a Hollywood ending.
You'd think the gates open, the bad guys flee, cue the triumphant music.
But Frankel reveals that the real psychological test actually starts after the trauma ends.
Because surviving the camp was only half the battle. Surviving freedom required a completely new psychological framework.
And the first hurdle was depersonalization.
Right. Yeah. Frankel describes walking out of the camp and seeing the world, seeing the blooming flowers, but feeling like it was all a dream. They just couldn't grasp freedom.
Why does that happen? Why couldn't they just be happy?
Because the nervous system cannot instantly downregulate from years of chronic, severe fight or flight back to a state of safety.
It's just stuck in survival mode.
Exactly. The brain has been wired for threat detection for so long that the reality of freedom simply couldn't penetrate their consciousness. They had lost the ability to feel pleasure.
And then, as the numbness wears off, the deeper psychological threats arrive. Bitterness and disillusionment.
The bitter realization that the world outside didn't really understand what they went through.
But the disillusionment is what really breaks my heart. I mean, Frankel returned to Vienna, bursting with the hope of seeing his family again. The very hope that kept him alive on those freezing marches.
And he found out that his pregnant wife, his brother, and his parents had all perished.
It's just devastating.
It touches on the concept of the provisional existence of unknown limit. In the camp, not knowing when the torture would end was agonizing. But returning home and finding that the future you dreamed of, the meaning that sustained you, no longer exists.
That is a disillusionment that just crushes the soul. And it creates a moral vacuum too, right?
Oh, completely.
There's this chilling story about his comrade in the oat field. Frankel was walking with a friend who had survived the camps with him, and they came across a field of young crops.
Right.
Frankel tried to avoid stepping on them, just out of basic respect for life.
Yeah.
But his comrade deliberately stomped right through the middle, furious that Frankel would care about oats when their families had been gassed.
He wanted to stain his hands with blood in revenge.
Exact.
And that's the danger of the liberated becoming the oppressor. Frankel had to carefully guide his friend back to the fundamental truth that no one has the right to do wrong.
Even if wrong has been done to them.
Right. Pain does not grant you a moral blank check.
So how does a psychiatrist take this profound, tragic realization, surviving the camp, surviving the loss of his family, surviving freedom, and turn it into a clinical practice to cure everyday people?
Well, he realized that survival, both inside the camp and out in the free world, depended entirely on having a meaning to live for.
So he formalized this into his own therapy.
Yes, what became known as the Third Viennese School of Psychotherapy, which he called Logotherapy.
Okay, I know Sigmund Freud is the first school, and Alfred Adler is the second. What is the fundamental difference here?
It comes down to human motivation. Freud argued that humanity's primary drive is the will to pleasure. We want to feel good and avoid pain.
Okay, makes sense.
And Adler argued for the will to power. We want status, control, superiority. But Frankel looks at both of them and says, no.
Logos is Greek for meaning, right?
Exactly. Frankel argues that our deepest, most fundamental drive is the will to meaning.
And if we don't find that meaning, things will go off the rails.
Drastically. When the will to meaning is frustrated, we fall into what Frankel calls the existential vacuum.
The existential vacuum.
Yeah. And this isn't just a clinical term for trauma survivors. It is a widespread phenomenon in the modern world.
Oh, absolutely. You see it everywhere. The Sunday night dread, the endless doom scrolling on social media, the midlife crises, it manifests as profound boredom, depression, aggression, and addiction.
Because nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
If you don't have a distinct meaning to guide you, you will fill that emptiness with something else.
Like what?
Well, Frankel noted that people in an existential vacuum tend to fall into one of two traps. They either do exactly what other people do, which is conformism, or they do what other people tell them to do, which is totalitarianism.
Wow. So to avoid that trap, logotherapy focuses on looking forward. It's less about digging through your childhood traumas on a therapist's couch and more about confronting you with the meaning of your future.
Precisely.
But let me push back a bit. Here's where it gets really interesting. Isn't it exhausting to always be searching for the grand meaning of life? You know, with a capital M and L.
Yeah, people ask that a lot.
Because most of us aren't writing groundbreaking books or surviving historical tragedies. What if my life is just normal?
It's a critical distinction. Frankel warns against searching for an abstract, overarching meaning of life. He uses a brilliant analogy of a movie.
How so?
Well, you cannot fully understand the grand meaning of a whole film until the very final scene rolls, right?
Sure.
However, for that final scene to make any sense, every individual frame and scene leading up to it has to make sense on its own. Meaning isn't one giant monolithic mountain you climb once. It changes from moment to moment.
So it's about finding the meaning in the specific frame you are currently in.
Exactly. It's about responsibleness. Recognizing what the present situation demands of you and responding to it with integrity. And Frankel outlines 3 very specific ways we can discover this meaning in everyday life.
What's the first way?
The first is by creating a work or doing a deed.
Like Frankel reconstructing his lost manuscript on tiny scraps of paper while suffering from typhus.
Right. It gave him a concrete task to focus on, literally keeping his cardiovascular system from collapsing.
What's the second way?
The second way is experiencing something or encountering someone. In its highest form, this is love.
But not just like romantic love, right?
No, he defines love far beyond biological drives or a side effect of sex. To him, love is experiencing another human being in their absolute, irreplaceable uniqueness.
Seeing their potential and helping them actualize it.
Yes. And the third way, which is probably the hardest to swallow, is the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
Right. When we can no longer change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves.
Which brings us to the core application for the listener. How do you actually shift your mindset to do that?
Yeah, if you are listening to this and you feel stuck, maybe you're in a dead-end job or facing a problem you can't solve, Frankl isn't telling you to just smile through the pain.
Not at all.
He's asking you to flip the script entirely. Use the Socratic dialogue technique. Stop asking the universe, what do I want out of life? That focuses on what you lack. Instead, reverse it. Ask yourself, what is life asking of me right now in this exact moment?
It turns you from a passive victim into an active responder.
And that simple pivot of responsibility is the foundation for the final major concept we need to explore, which Frankl details in his 1984 postscript.
Yes, he calls it the case for a tragic optimism.
Because life is inherently difficult. We can't pretend bad things don't happen, so how do we remain optimistic?
Frankl introduces this concept of the tragic triad. The triad consists of the three inescapable realities of human existence: pain, guilt, and death.
None of us escape those.
No human being escapes them. Tragic optimism is the human capacity to remain optimistic in spite of this triad.
So it's the conscious choice to extract growth from pain.
Yes, to derive betterment from guilt, and to use the transitoriness of life, the reality of death, as an incentive to take responsible action today.
It's sort of like realizing that gravity is always going to pull you down. Instead of sitting around complaining about gravity, tragic optimism is the science of building an airplane to use that very physics to fly.
I love that framing. If guilt is the gravity pulling you down, you don't just wallow in the weight of it. You recognize it and you design wings through accountability, apologies, and changed behavior to create lift.
You take the tragedy and you build something with it.
Exactly. And Frankl shares the incredible story of Jerry Long to illustrate this.
Oh, the Jerry Long story. He was paralyzed from the neck down in a diving accident when he was just 17 years old.
Right. And instead of succumbing to the tragedy, he learned to type using a mouth stick.
He attended college courses via an intercom system, and he studied psychology. He eventually wrote a letter to Frankl that stated, "I broke my neck. It didn't break me."
He found that his severe handicap actually enhanced his ability to help other people. He turned his unavoidable suffering into a unique achievement.
Wow.
And in doing so, he engaged in what Frankl calls noodynamics.
Let's define that, because it sounds like heavy clinical jargon, but it's actually incredibly practical.
Noodynamics is the spiritual tension required for mental health. You know, in modern wellness culture, we often push the idea that the goal of life is homeostasis.
Like a perfectly relaxed, tensionless state where nothing bothers you.
Right. But Frankl vehemently disagrees with that. He argues that a tensionless state is actually dangerous.
Because it breeds the existential vacuum.
Exactly. He says what a person truly needs is the healthy dynamic tension between where they are right now and the meaningful goal they are striving to achieve.
That gap, that tension, is no dynamics. It's a pull of the future.
It's what gets you out of bed in the morning.
But just to clarify, because this can easily be misinterpreted, Frankl isn't saying you need to seek out suffering to find meaning, right?
Oh, absolutely not. He strictly warns against seeking out unnecessary suffering. If a problem is fixable, you fix it.
If you have a headache, take medicine.
Exactly. Enduring avoidable suffering isn't heroic, it's masochistic. Tragic optimism only applies to unavoidable suffering.
The incurable illnesses, the loss of a loved one, the historical events completely beyond your control.
Right. So if we want to cultivate this tragic optimism in our own lives, Frankl offers a brilliant mental exercise. He calls it his categorical imperative.
Okay, what is it?
He says, live as if you were living already for the second time and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you're about to act now.
It's the ultimate exercise in mental time travel.
It really is.
So imagine you are facing a difficult decision right now. Try applying this to your own life. Imagine it's 10 years in the future and you made the wrong choice, and you are living with the regret. Now imagine you've been granted the magical ability to time travel back to this exact moment to fix it. How would you act?
It forces a profound sense of urgency and responsibility into the present moment. It strips away the excuses and makes you realize that your future is not yet written and your choices today matter intensely.
Which brings us full circle, really. We've gone from the unimaginable suffocating darkness of the concentration camps to the bright, fiercely forward-looking light of logotherapy.
And we've seen that the overarching, undeniable theme of Frankl's life and work is personal responsibility.
It really all boils down to one simple yet incredibly difficult truth to master. Between a stimulus and your response, there is a space.
Yes.
And in that space lies your power to choose your response.
Yeah.
In your response lies your growth and your ultimate freedom.
You may not control the conditions of your life, but you are the absolute master of your attitude toward them.
And Frankl didn't just write about this, he lived it. Late in his life, his students asked him to write down the meaning of his own life in a single sentence.
He wrote it down privately on a piece of paper.
Yeah, and one student bravely guessed what he had written, and they were spot on.
Do you remember the sentence?
I do. Frankl's sentence was, "The meaning of your life is to help others find the meaning of theirs."
By perfect realization of meaning through love and deed, he dedicated his survival and every day after to ensuring others could navigate their own dark oceans.
So we turn this to you, the listener. If you had to write down the meaning of your life today in just one sentence, what would it be?
It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to save the world. It just has to be true to you for the frame of life you are in right now.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Viktor Frankl's man's search for meaning. It's a heavy topic, but arguably the most uplifting message humanity has ever produced.
Definitely.
Remember that dark ocean we talked about at the beginning? The crashing waves, the total loss of control? Well, it turns out you don't need a boat to survive the storm. You just need to know why you're swimming. Catch you on the next deep dive.